One of the most important skills a photographer can have is knowledge of composition. This means knowing how to place and rearrange certain elements in a photo to create a desired effect. There are many photography composition techniques and rules, and in this video I'll be going over 30 of them. In fact, these are the same photography composition techniques and rules that I use on my photo shoots to create photos that not only I love, but my clients love as well. So whether you're new to photography or you've been at it for a while, these tips will surely help your photographs and help provide a framework and mindset when approaching a new scene. So let's get started. Before diving into the techniques, I think it's important to briefly cover what composition actually is. Put simply, it's the arrangement of elements within a photo to create the desired effect. The way you arrange elements like your subject, background, and other features will directly affect how viewers feel about the image. Photography composition is all about how you arrange elements within a photo. It's an art form, with certain guidelines and principles that will be used to create images with impact. But just like with any art form or rule, they're meant to be broken, but only once you have a strong understanding of the rule. By understanding the basics of photography composition, you'll be able to use them in your own photos to create better images, and eventually break the rules to create your own creative compositional masterpieces. One of the most basic and important rules in photography is the rule of thirds. This means dividing an image into 3 parts, horizontally and vertically, creating 9 equal sections. Placing key elements at these intersections will create a more visually appealing photo. It's called the rule of thirds because by creating these imaginary lines, it divides the photo into thirds. Placing a key element or the subject at one of these intersections can draw the viewer's eyes and create balance in the photo. For example, in this image I took in Japan, I wanted the main focal point to be the sun. In order to do that, I placed the sun on an intersection on the rule of thirds. In this case, I placed it on the bottom left. But why is placing an element at an intersection important? It's believed that our eyes naturally go to one of these intersections when looking at an image, so they act as natural guides. And while it's called a rule, it's more of a creative suggestion. Here's another example using a portrait. The main focal point I wanted to be in this portrait was to be her eye. In order to do that, I placed her eye at the intersection of the rule of thirds, in this case at the top right intersection. Now, you don't always have to follow this rule, but using it will help you create better photos. I listed this first because this is often my go-to photography composition technique, and I go into most photo shoots and sessions with this composition tip in the back of my mind. I believe this technique builds into a lot of other techniques such as the golden spiral and triangle, which I'll be touching on later in this video. The second compositional technique is called a frame within a frame. And a frame within a frame is an easy and effective way to draw the viewer's eyes into the photo. It creates a sense of depth and can be used to highlight your subject. This technique involves placing something in front of the subject that acts as a frame, such as trees or other objects. This creates a natural border for your subject and draws the eye into the photo. By placing a frame in front of the subject, you'll be creating a frame within a frame because the image you capture from the camera lens is already one frame. For example, let's say you have a subject standing between 2 trees. The 2 trees will be one frame, and the image itself will be the other frame, creating a frame within a frame. You can see this example with a portrait I took of a friend. Notice how the 2 palm trees are framing her within the image. Other things you can use to create a frame within a frame include arches, doorways, windows, and even hands. The possibilities are endless. Here's another example of another portrait I took. In this case, you can see that I'm framing the subject with the palm trees in the background. It's very subtle, but it's there. The third compositional technique is called centering and symmetry. Now, they say symmetry is what makes an extremely attractive person attractive. Well, I believe the same goes for an aesthetically pleasing photo. Centering and symmetry are techniques that involve placing the subject in the center of the photo. This creates a sense of balance because it's evenly distributed on both sides. The best way to use this technique is to imagine having the image down the middle and making sure both sides are like mirrored images of themselves. For example, take a look at this image. As you can see, it's very balanced on both sides. If you were to mirror it, it's the same exact thing. By doing this, you create a sense of balance in the photo, and the viewer's eyes will be drawn to the subject without being distracted by other elements. It also helps if you use symmetry when combining objects in the background. For example, try placing 2 trees or 2 people on each side of your subject for a symmetrical composition. The fourth compositional technique is leading lines. Leading lines are lines in a photo that act as a great way to draw the viewer's attention into the photo. These can be anything from that has lines, such as bridges, fences, roads, you name it. It's called leading lines because they lead the viewer's eyes into the frame and can be used to create a sense of depth as well as direct attention to your subject. Leading lines are also great for creating a sense of movement within an image. For example, if you have people walking in a straight line toward your subject, it will draw the viewer's eyes toward them. Take a look at this example using the bridge rope as leading lines, leading to the subject in the photo. You can also use leading lines to draw attention away from your subject if you want to focus on another element in the background or foreground. I love using leading lines in my images, and it's often one of my go-to photography composition techniques as well. Here's another example of a portrait I took using a single leading line. If you pay attention to the line that the subject's hand is on, you can notice that's a leading line. The fifth compositional technique is called foreground depth and interest, and having this can make your photos really stand out. This is a technique that involves including elements in the foreground to give your photo more depth. This could be anything from rocks, trees, plants, or even people. Having something in the foreground gives the photo more texture and dimension than if it was just a flat image. It also helps to create a sense of depth in the photo by adding elements that are closer to the camera and further away from it. Including something like an animal or a person in the foreground can also help draw attention to your subject, as our eyes naturally wander toward movement and color. For example, look at this image by Dave, and its great use of rocks in the foreground to provide depth. The sixth composition technique is called triangles and diagonal lines, and having these are a great way to increase dynamic composition and tension within an image. This technique involves using triangles or diagonal lines to draw the viewer's eyes into the photo. The triangle shape can be created by having two elements on either side of your subject, such as buildings or trees, and then an element in front of them that forms the top of the triangle. Diagonal lines can also be used to create a sense of movement and interest in your photo. It's a great way to draw the viewer's eyes into the frame, as well as add some drama and tension to an image. Dynamic composition is achieved by having multiple elements of varying sizes and angles that create visual interest. The tension in the photo is caused by lines that are not horizontal or vertical, but diagonal. Diagonal lines create a sense of instability in our subconscious. Perhaps this is due to the fact that diagonal lines are rarely seen in nature and often suggest falling or slipping in human nature. Take a look at this image by Gabriel that uses leading lines as well as triangle and diagonal lines to add depth and an interesting dynamic to the photo. Here's another example using the examples of buildings. If we look at this image, we may notice that it's compositionally pleasing and aesthetically pleasing. But what makes it so? They're all creating triangles. The seventh compositional technique involves creating patterns. As humans, we're naturally attracted to patterns, and this can be seen with our everyday life. We have patterns such as waking up, going to work, working out, coming home, eating, sleeping, and repeat on a pattern. Creating patterns is a photography composition technique that can help add interest to your photos. It involves using elements in the scene to create a pattern or rhythm of sorts. This could be anything from repeating lines, shapes, colors, or textures. This technique helps to draw the viewer's eyes around the frame and creates a sense of movement and flow. For example, you could have a landscape with several trees in the background and then use some rocks or stones in the foreground to create a pattern. This helps break up the monotony of the photo and adds visual interest. Here's an example of architectural photography that leverages the interesting pattern of the building to add visual depth and interest. As you can see, Victor took an image of a building that has great patterns on it, creating visual interest and depth to the photo. Take a look at this example using patterns from the road. Creating patterns can also be done with people or animals in your photos. You could have a group of people standing in a line or arrange them in a circle to create an interesting pattern. Using patterns in photography is great for creating balance and directing the viewer's eyes around the frame. It's also a great way to add some movement and rhythm to your photos. The eighth compositional technique involves pattern breaking. Now, we just talked all about patterns, so now let's talk about breaking them. Pattern breaking is a photography composition technique that involves breaking up patterns in an image. It can be a very effective way to draw attention to the subject and direct the viewer's eyes around the frame. This technique involves looking for repeating elements or colors in a scene, and then using something to break them up. This could be anything from a person walking through the scene or an element that stands out from the others. Using the previous example in our previous composition technique, now take a look at this pattern breaking technique using the contrasting color of the yellow against the black and white pattern of the crossing lines. This technique is great for adding interest and balance to a photo. It can also be used to create tension and drama, as breaking up patterns can often give off a feeling of uneasiness. Have you ever seen those movie scenes or images where everybody is walking one way and then you have one person walking the opposite way towards them? That's pattern breaking. Another example could be if you had a landscape with a lot of trees or buildings that all look the same, and then you have one tree or building that stands out from the others. This breaks up the patterns and creates visual interest. Here's another example with people using a crowded train filled with people. As you can see in this image by Rink Doman, we're often first drawn to the lady because she's staring directly at us while everybody's eyes are turned away. Lastly, here's an example of Flowers in a Field by Rupert Britton. Using pattern breaking can help your photo stand out and draw attention to your subject. It's an effective way to direct the viewer's eyes and create a dynamic composition. The ninth compositional technique involves texture. In photography, texture refers to the surface quality of an object in a scene. It can be used to add visual interest and create a more dynamic composition. Using texture in your photos is great for adding depth and drawing attention to certain elements within the frame. The key is to find textures that stand out from the other elements in the scene. For example, stone rocks or a rippling lake could be used to add texture to a landscape. In a still life, you could use fabric or fur to create an interesting texture. Take a look at this example, leveraging the ripple in the lake to add texture. Using textures in your photo can help make them more visually appealing and draw attention to important elements in the frame. It's also great for creating depth and giving the viewer something to explore. Next time you're out taking photos, keep an eye out for interesting textures that you can incorporate into your compositions. Some of my favorite textures include stone walls, grass, rippling water, fur, fabric, and bark. Play around with different textures to find what works best for your photos. The 10th compositional technique is called the rule of odds, and while it's called a rule, it's more of a creative suggestion. The rule of odds states that an odd number of elements in a photo will be more visually appealing than an even number of elements. For example, instead of having 2 people in a portrait, try to have 3 or 5. This helps create some visual interest and can help draw attention to the subject. Here's an example of a photo of 3 palm trees. The rule of odds isn't set in stone, and it's not something you have to adhere to strictly. However, it can be a helpful guideline when trying to create a more dynamic composition. Personally, I don't like this composition technique that much because it's too simple. Oh, just have an odd number of elements in my photo and I'll have a great composition. Not really. For example, take a look at this photo of 2 palm trees, and even though it's an even number, I still think the photo looks great. I just wanted to include this one in the list in case you hear others talking about the rule of odds. The 11th compositional technique is called simplicity, and simplicity is one of the most important compositional techniques you should know. It involves stripping away all unnecessary elements and keeping only what's essential in the frame. This can be a difficult concept to grasp, as it's often counterintuitive to think that less is more. But when used correctly, simplicity can be an incredibly powerful tool for creating impactful photos. When framing your shot, try to remove any distractions that could draw attention away from the main subject. This can be done by using a shallow depth of field, shooting from a different angle, or cropping the scene in post-production. Keep in mind that simplicity doesn't mean you have to eliminate all elements. It's more about finding the right balance between elements. Personally, when I'm going for simplicity, I aim to have only 3 to 5 elements in a photo, as more than that could clutter the image, causing the viewer to not know what to pay attention to. For example, in this portrait I took, I have 3 focal points or elements. They include the subject, the grass, and the sky. Here's another portrait. The focal points include the subject, the grass, and the trees behind her. Simplicity is one of my favorite composition techniques because it can help you create strong, impactful photos that tell a story and convey emotion. Contrast this idea of simplicity with a photo that most of us have taken starting out on our photography journey. In this photo, you can see that there are many elements, about 11, and it's hard to focus on the main subject. And by no means am I saying this is a bad photo. It just has a lot of focal points that makes it hard to focus on the main subject. Let's say we cropped in this image a bit to reduce some of the focal points or elements, and it already becomes a bit easier to notice the subject and produces an overall better composition. I also wanted to note that keeping a composition simple is not necessarily about only having one person in the frame. In this example, you can see there are multiple people, but they all act as one unit because they are doing similar things. Because of this, they can be seen as one focal point, as there isn't one person in particular doing anything unique. So in the image, you can see that there's 4 focal points. The first is the door, the second are the people, the third is the door on the other side, and the fourth are the banners up above. Paying particular close attention to the second focal point, there are multiple people, but they're pretty much doing all the same thing. If one person really stood out, such as staring straight at the camera lens or wearing a color that really stood out, then that would act as another focal point. The 12th compositional technique is called filling the frame. Filling the frame does a great job of drawing attention to the main subject in the image. It involves getting up close and personal with your subject so that it occupies most of the space in the frame. This eliminates distractions and creates an intimate connection between the viewer and the subject. When shooting, try to get as close as possible to the subject so that it fills up most of the frame. Of course, this will depend on what type of photo you're taking and how close you are physically able to get. This technique is particularly useful when shooting portraits, photos of buildings, or capturing wildlife and nature. It can help create a powerful connection between the viewer and the subject. Here's an example of a portrait where I tried to fill the whole frame with the subject. Take a look at this great photo that does an excellent job of filling the frame by Georgie. It makes the photo feel very personal and intimate, and it can be a great way to draw attention to certain elements in the frame. The 13th compositional technique involves using black and white. Black and white photography is a great way to add an extra layer and depth of emotion to your images. By removing color from the equation, you are forcing the viewer to focus on form, texture, patterns, and tones. This can help create a very striking image that stands out from the rest. Take a look at this excellent yet minimalistic photo of a tree. If you ask me, if it were in color, it might not be as impactful because we wouldn't pay such close attention to the contrast and texture of the photo that make it so great. When shooting in black and white, try to think about what elements will be most effective in a monochrome photo. For example, patterns and shapes can often look very striking in black and white photos. Color can be a powerful tool for communication, but sometimes black and white is a better option when you want to convey certain emotions or ideas. When it comes to black and white photography, you'll want to go into the photo shoot knowing that you want to capture a black and white photo. I found that going to the session with this state of mind will allow you to focus on the patterns and shapes within the frame. The 14th compositional technique is called negative space. Negative space does a great job of drawing attention to the subject of the photo. It involves leaving blank spaces in the frame that give your subject breathing room and create a sense of balance in the composition. This also helps draw focus to the main element by removing distractions from around it. As you can tell, this is the complete opposite of filling the frame as mentioned earlier. When creating negative space, think about how you can use it to create visual balance. This could be playing around with the placement of elements in the frame, or using different depths of field to draw attention to the subject. Negative space is a great way to make your photo stand out and convey emotion without having too many elements competing for attention in the image. The way I love to use negative space is to place the subject either in the right or left third of the image and leave the other 2/3 of the image as negative space or breathing room. For example, in this image, I have the people, sand, and water on the bottom third of the image, and I have the sky filling the top 2/3 of the image to give some breathing room and add a sense of space to the image. Here's another great example using negative space by Clay Banks. I found negative space images work well for most types of photography, such as portraits, landscapes, and street photography. The 15th compositional technique revolves around photographing from below. Photographing or shooting from below is a great way to add variation and uniqueness to an image and different types of images. This involves shooting from a lower angle than your subject rather than shooting from eye level or above. This helps create an interesting perspective and creates a kind of power dynamic between you and the subject. It can be a great way to add drama and emotion to an image without any other elements. When shooting from below, try to keep the angle low enough so that you can still capture details, but not too low where it becomes uncomfortable for the viewer. Here's an example of a portrait I shot from below to add a unique and different perspective. Here's another example using this previous image I've shown earlier. I shoot from below to add a sense of drama to the image. This technique works really well when photographing people, animals, or landscapes. It's also a great way to create dynamic street photography images. Have you ever seen those images that are captured with the camera just a bit above a road looking up? That's what I'm talking about. The 16th compositional technique revolves around photographing from above, so this is the opposite of photographing from below. This is another great way to add a unique perspective to an image. You may have also heard of shooting from a bird's eye view, which is pretty much the same thing. This involves shooting from a higher angle than your subject rather than just shooting from eye level or below. This helps to show the environment in which the subject resides and can help draw focus to the main elements. For example, in this portrait I photographed from above. It's also a great technique when shooting landscapes and street photography, as it can help to add depth to the image. When photographing from above, try not to go so high so that you don't lose details in your images. If you're photographing a person, then this isn't really my favorite compositional technique, because it tends to make the person look small. Great for newborn photography, but not good for a portrait of a strong-looking male or female. If you're shooting birds or animals, then this is a great way to show the relationship between them and their environment. If you are into aerial photography or drone photography, then this is usually your go-to photography compositional technique. For example, in this cityscape image, this is taken from an above angle to produce a beautiful image and scene by Pavel Nolbert. The 17th compositional technique revolves around using analogous colors. Using analogous colors is a great way to create a more balanced image. Analogous colors are 3 or 4 adjacent hues on the color wheel, which creates a harmonious effect when used together. For example, using red and orange together creates a warm feeling, and blue and green together give off a calming vibe. By using analogous colors in your composition, you can create a more cohesive look and feel to the image. This works especially well for landscapes or still life images, as it helps bring out the details and textures of the scene. In this portrait example, I use the analogous colors of green and blue to add a sense of cool tones and moodiness to the image. When trying this technique, try to use subtle gradients of the same color to give an extra level of depth and interest to the image. Here's another example by Akshay Nadavanti, using the same exact analogous colors I used of yellow, green, and blue. The 18th compositional technique revolves around using complementary colors. Complementary colors is a great way to add contrast and depth to an image. Complementary colors are 2 hues opposite to each other on the color wheel, for example, red and green or blue and orange. This technique works really well when shooting portraits or still life images, as it helps draw attention to the main elements of the image. It can also help create a contrast between 2 similar objects or scenes and helps add depth to the image. When using complementary colors, try to keep them subtle, as too much can end up looking overly saturated or chaotic. This technique works best when used in moderation and will often give your photos an extra bit of visual appeal. My favorite complementary color combination is orange and blue, which is exactly what you see when photographing an ocean landscape, the water and the sun. The 19th compositional technique revolves around using monochromatic colors. Using monochromatic colors in an image is a great way to create a certain unified look and feel to your image. Monochromatic colors are simple shades of one single color, for example, different hues of blue or red. This helps unify all the elements of an image by tying them together with the same color and makes them appear more cohesive. For example, this image uses the monochromatic colors of blue. When using this technique, try to use subtle gradations of the same color, as this will give your images a much better look. Depending on the color, monochromatic colors are great for creating extremes such as moody, joyful, or atmospheric scenes that draw out the best qualities of an image. The 20th photography composition technique revolves around using balance in a scene. Using balance in a scene is a great composition technique to create an interesting and pleasing looking image. This means making sure there are equal amounts of elements on one side or the other. If you were to use the rule of thirds in an image and the image was still feeling visually empty, then you would place another element or subject on the other side of the frame. For example, if you have a tree on one side of the frame, then you may want to add something like a mountain or lake on the other side. This helps to create a sense of balance and symmetry in the photo. The difference is that you will want to have one main subject and a secondary subject, so they aren't both competing for visual dominance. Take a look at this photo I took for a graduation session. As you can see, the subject is on the left half of the photo. If there was nothing on the right side, it would be a bit visually empty. By having the building on the right side, it adds visual balance. It's also important to pay attention to how you distribute different elements in the frame so that nothing looks too crowded or too empty. This can help draw more focus on the main subject without looking too overwhelming or distracting. When using this technique, try to keep the elements in close proximity so that there is a nice flow throughout the image. This also helps to avoid any distractions or empty parts of the photo. The 21st composition technique revolves around using contrast in your image. Using contrast in your images is a great way to add visual depth, create visual interest, and to create an image that looks unique and interesting. Contrast involves adding two opposite elements together, like light and dark or warm and cold colors. For example, adding a bright red flower to a moody blue sky can really make the image pop and draw attention to both elements. This technique is great for portraits or still life images as it helps add depth and interest to the scene. For example, take a look at this image of a flower that uses color for contrast. When using this technique, try to keep the contrast subtle, so it doesn't become too overwhelming or distracting. This can also be done with color, texture, or light, and will often give your image an extra bit of visual appeal. If you use contrast with colors, then you'll most likely be using complementary colors, as mentioned earlier. The 22nd compositional technique is called rule of space. The rule of space is a great way to create a more dynamic and unique looking image. This means when photographing a subject, adding an element of space in front of the subject. This works especially well with portraits or animals as it helps draw your eye toward the main subject. For example, if you were taking a photo of a person, then you may want to have them looking in the direction of an open space, as this will add more depth and interest to the image. When using this technique, try to keep the space subtle so it doesn't turn into too much empty negative space. By using this technique, you can help avoid having a boring or flat photo and create something that is more visually appealing and interesting. For example, in this image, the subject is looking to the left, so I try to have more space in the left half of the photo to create this sense of space. You can also have the opposite of this and have a subject facing the other way. If you want to see a great example of this, then I recommend watching or studying Mr. Robot's cinematography, as the show implements this a lot to create a sense of tension along with a state of feeling trapped. The 23rd compositional technique is called juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is a great way to add further dimensions and story to your image. Juxtaposition involves placing two elements together that contrast against each other. For example, an image of a blooming flower in the foreground of a cemetery backdrop could symbolize the cycle of life and death. Juxtaposition is a subtle yet powerful composition technique. When using this technique, try to keep the elements close together so they are in the same frame. This will help create a stronger connection and add more impact to your photos. Unlike using complementary colors, juxtaposition is more about the story behind the contrast instead of just using colors. For example, another example of powerful juxtaposition could be a photo of a homeless camp in the foreground with giant corporate skyscrapers in the background, symbolizing wealth and disparity. Another example of juxtaposition can be seen in this image of an older building in front of corporate skyscrapers, symbolizing the old and new and modern development. Overall, great photo by Janice Baitens. The 24th photography composition technique is called the golden ratio. The golden ratio is a mathematical equation that is often used in photography to create pleasing images. The ratio is based on the Fibonacci sequence, which starts with 0 and 1. The golden ratio is equal to approximately 1.618, and to spare you with other technical details, the main takeaway for photographers with the golden ratio is what's called the Fibonacci sequence, or golden spiral, which is an imaginary spiral used to create more aesthetically pleasing images. Many times this will be in the form of a logarithmic spiral that looks like a circular pattern with outward curves branching off it. By placing your subject within the golden spiral, you can create an attractive composition that leads the viewer's eyes throughout the image and around the subject. This can be particularly helpful when creating landscapes or other wide-angle compositions, as it will help direct the viewer's attention in a more specific way. For example, in this portrait, the golden spiral can be applied. The golden ratio is not always necessary to create an attractive composition, but understanding and applying this concept can be a great way to improve your photos and make them stand out from the crowd. Here's another example using a portrait I shot. I personally never set out on a photo shoot with the golden spiral in mind, as I'd rather focus on symmetry or the rule of thirds. I think most photographers can find an accidental way they created the golden spiral, rather than composing an image with the spiral in mind. The 25th composition technique revolves around golden triangles. Golden triangles are a variation of the golden ratio and are another mathematical ratio. The three sides of the triangle are proportional to each other in a way that creates an aesthetically pleasing composition. This technique can be used by dividing the frame into 4 rectangles, with 2 on either side and 1 in the center. An easier way to think of this is to just have a diagonal line from one corner to the other. Along this diagonal line are 2 smaller lines that go to the other corners in the frame, creating a 90-degree angle along the middle diagonal line. The golden triangle is most often used in landscape photography, as it can help create an interesting composition that draws the viewer's eyes around the frame. By placing your subject along one of the 2 diagonals, you can create a more powerful composition than if you simply placed it in the center of the frame. For example, using an image I showed earlier, we can also apply the golden triangle to set the sun as the focal point. Here's another example with a little Lego man as the subject. As you can see, he lines up perfectly. And this image is taken by Marco Montero. Like with other composition techniques, the golden triangle is not always necessary to create an aesthetically pleasing image, but understanding what it is can help you grow as a photographer. And similar to the golden ratio, I believe it can be a bit difficult to set out on a shoot with this composition in mind, and most photographers can claim to have a golden triangle within a photo that just follows the rule of thirds composition rule. The 26th compositional technique revolves around using layers. Adding layers to an image can help direct the viewer's eyes around the frame to create a more interesting looking image. Layers are simply 2 or more distinct elements that sit on different planes in the scene. The layers in an image usually consist of the background, the middle distance, and the foreground. For example, in a landscape photo, you may have a distant mountain range in the background, trees in the middle distance, and then rocks or other objects in the foreground. Taking a look at this photo by Roberto Nixon, we see great use of this. We can see the mountains are in the background, the city is in the middle ground, and the person taking the photo is in the foreground. By including multiple layers in your composition, you can create an image that draws the viewer's eyes around the scene and gives them something to explore. This technique is particularly useful for landscape photography or any type of wide-angle shot. You don't always have to include 3 layers in every image, but by understanding how this technique works, you can improve your compositions and make them more eye-catching. The 27th photography composition revolves around using the decisive moment. And while this is more a photography mindset and not necessarily a compositional technique, I wanted to include it on this list because I believe using the decisive moment can strongly influence the composition of your images. The decisive moment comes from famous French street photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. The decisive moment essentially means waiting for the right moment to press the shutter. The decisive moment is often a compositional technique and mindset a photographer has when photographing street photography or landscape photography. It consists of the photographer finding a scene they like and then already creating a composition. The photographer then waits until something enters the scene that adds value to the image. Of course, I'm crudely oversimplifying it, but that's the gist of it. For example, in street photography, you may find a scene that looks interesting, such as a rain puddle, and then wait until somebody enters the frame in an interesting way, such as a child jumping over that rain puddle. With landscape photography, you could take a photo of the sky and then wait for something to happen, such as clouds moving or birds flying into your composition. Taking a look at this beautiful street photograph, I'm sure Molly Porter found the lighting in this scene to be perfect and waited for the right subject to enter the frame. By waiting for the right moment to take the photo, you can create some truly unique compositions that otherwise would not have been possible. Including the decisive moment in your composition technique can help you capture those moments that only happen for a split second and make your photos stand out from the others. The 28th compositional technique revolves around human interest. As photographers, we're always looking for ways to have our images stand out from the rest. One way to do this is to add human interest. Imagine you have a photo of a giant mountain. Cool, it's a giant mountain. Now imagine that giant mountain along with a human or group of humans in the middle ground to show the scale and majesty of the mountain. This makes the image much more impactful and interesting to look at. This technique works great for landscape photos as it gives a sense of scale and adds an element of humanity to the photo. By including this technique in your compositions, you can create powerful images that capture both the beauty of the natural world and the human element in a single frame. For example, take a look at this image by William Manuel. He does a great job of adding human interest to an already great looking setting. If you take a photo of something vast or beautiful and it just isn't conveying that sense of beauty in the image, then try to add a human element to the photo. You can do this by having a friend stand or walk somewhere in the frame, or you can use the decisive moment as mentioned earlier to wait until someone enters the scene. The 29th compositional technique revolves around using curved lines. Curved lines in an image is a great way to direct and lead the viewer's eyes into the image. Curved lines in your photos can draw the viewer's eyes around the frame and create a sense of flow. Curved lines can be used for many different types of photography, including landscape, cityscape, street photography, and much more. It works well with any type of photography that includes leading lines, as it will add a sense of dynamic movement to the image. If you've heard of the S-curve or C-curve, then this is pretty much the same thing. For example, take a look at this portrait I took using the road as a S or C curve to lead the eye to the subject and provide a bit more visual depth. Here's another example where you can see the road has a curve to it leading our eyes. Whether you're looking for a subtle curve or a more dramatic effect, by understanding how curved lines work in compositions, you can improve your photos and make them more interesting to look at. The 30th and final composition technique revolves around using parallel lines. Parallel lines is a great way to add another pattern and leading lines to the image to create depth and lead the viewer's eyes throughout the image. This can be used in many different types of photography, including landscape and street photography. Parallel lines are a great way to create depth in your images as they lead the viewer's eyes into the frame, creating a sense of depth and perspective. Examples of using parallel lines in photography include train tracks, escalator steps, road lines, bridges, etc. For example, take a look at this image by Heather that uses the lines in the park benches to add some parallel lines. When using parallel lines, it can often be paired with the idea of leading lines, as well as can be seen in the example above. In conclusion, there is no single right way to compose a photo, but knowing these techniques will certainly help you capture compositions that stand out from the rest. And like I mentioned in the beginning, there are no hard set rules in art, only creative suggestions. But it's important to know the rules before you can even begin breaking them. So with that being said, go out there and start photographing. Thanks for watching.